What kind of surprised me the most was why it had sort of a much bigger impact, I think, in credit than maybe other industries, at least from my perspective. And maybe it's because there's an inherent risk in lending. The dollars go out the door. It's a big risk who you give money to. Decisions relate directly to dollars too. And also the competitive landscape is pretty severe. So any edge you can get really helps your business.
Hello, this is Shawn Budde of Ensemble X, and this is the Ensemble X Exchange podcast. Today I'm talking with Jim McGuire, our own Managing Director of Data Science here at Ensemble X. Throughout his career, Jim has built and deployed over a dozen credit models, supported in-house data science teams, and advised clients on AI underwriting best practices. He was previously the principal data scientist at Flowcast, applying machine learning to global trade risk assessments, and led the machine learning team at Zest AI. Jim holds a BA in physics from Dartmouth College and a PhD in physics from the University of California, San Diego. Welcome to the podcast, Jim.
Great to be here, Shawn.
So, Jim, you grew up near Anaheim, and then you went about as far across country as you could to Dartmouth. How did that come about?
Yeah, it wasn't really on my radar per se. I was looking at a lot of the University of California schools, kind of expected to go to Berkeley or San Diego or Santa Cruz or something. And I was playing baseball at the time. Actually, the baseball coach from Dartmouth approached everyone. I was playing in a summer league at the time, and he was kind of asked me what my GPA was, and I told him, and he kind of was like, "Oh, but you should apply to Dartmouth." And I was like, "Oh, I never really thought about that. Ivy League school across the country, very, very different than California." So I did, and lo and behold, a few months later, I got accepted. I actually applied to Cornell too, got in there. Ended up going to Dartmouth. It was on a map about as far away as I could get from home. It was in the middle of a forest, small school, liberal arts college. Everything about it appealed to me. But I have to be honest, I never visited the school before I went. And so, you were just talking about a family member of yours going there for freshman orientation this week. And I just dropped in the middle of New Hampshire, and it was a whole different world for me, to be honest. It took me about a year to adjust.
Well, you seem to have adjusted because you now live in a pretty foresty place as well.
That's true. I live in a city called Lake Arrowhead. It's in the mountains kind of northeast of Los Angeles. So about a mile high. So we get some winter weather here. We have ski resorts around, and surrounded by national forest.
And do you have critters?
There's lots of critters around, lots of, coyotes, raccoons, normal kind of stuff. We do have bears here. I've personally not seen too many bears in my city, although I have neighbors who catch them on their Ring cameras all the time. So I keep waiting for that kind of fun interaction with a bear. But I've had a few interactions with bears camping that I don't really want to repeat. So
yeah. Okay. Well, let's talk about the journey then, from California to Dartmouth, then back to California to get your PhD. But eventually you left physics. Maybe not eventually, maybe more immediately after your PhD. Why was that?
So it wasn't immediately after my PhD. I did the normal route I did a postdoc at National Institute of Standards and Technology in Boulder. I did teach for a year at the University of Denver after that. But to be honest, I had never really considered a world not doing physics. When I was a teenager, I think I was 15, I had a teacher recommend A Brief History of Time to me. Just immediately after I read that, I knew I wanted to be a physicist. Laser focused on that all through college, straight to grad school, never really thought about doing much else. Kind of when I ended my PhD program and started looking at postdocs, I never really found my niche, to be honest. I wasn't super happy with the research I was doing, and I tried to switch gears a little bit in my postdoc, and that didn't really go anywhere. I kind of realized, for me personally, when you get into academia, the goal is to really get laser focused on one particular thing. And you spend your whole career becoming an expert in that, and I 100% respect that. I'm not sure that's my personality. I'm kind of more broad. I like learning about a lot of different things. I really love the process of learning physics. I love the process of teaching physics. But when it came to actually being like an academic physicist, I'm not sure that was the best job for me, to be honest. So I kind of decided to bail. Now, to be honest, in the world today, that's a well-worn path from the physics department into data science. I'd imagine significantly more people go along that path than actually go into a PhD program now, or even out of a PhD into academia. It's a job that's waiting for you there. And there's a lot of reasons for that we can get into. But this was, 2007. That option wasn't completely obvious. So it was a little bit humbling for me, honestly. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I didn't really know where in industry I would fit in. It took me a few jobs to kind of wrap my head around what my skills were and how I could contribute. I'd say the huge break for me was being hired at Zest Finance by none other than Shawn Budde. And the reason for that is because I'm not a developer. I wasn't a software developer. I didn't do that in grad school. I didn't have any particular credit experience, but luckily at the time, Zest was a Series A startup and was hiring more for horsepower. And so Shawn and Douglas and others there kind of saw that I could contribute. But one of the great things about startups is like from day one, you have to contribute. You have to find your place in them, or else you get flushed out. So it worked out great for me. I told Shawn this many times. It was a lot of right place, right time for me. I'm not even sure that even a year later, if I had gotten through the interview process at Zest, but joining a team of just 12 people, just starting out, very enthusiastic, startup in Hollywood, it was a great experience for me.
Yeah. So talk to me a little more about that. What did you bring from physics into the machine learning? Like what applied? And you say it's a well-worn path now. Why has it become a well-worn path?
Yeah, that's a great question. Physics, every step you take in the physics path of learning more and more, you're learning better and better how to simplify things, how to make approximations that sort of help you, frame out a difficult problem into bite-sized chunks that you know how to handle. So, just the way to approach problem solving, I think you just spend 4 years in undergrad, I spent 5 or 6 years in grad school. That's all you do every single day. So it really sets you up for any career where you kind of need to attack things in that manner. I'd also say, and this might just be more about the personalities in physics, is you have to be self-motivated and self-sufficient to succeed. You cannot rely on anyone else to kind of bring you there. You have to bring yourself there. And so that flushes out a lot of people too. I'd say the math we learn in physics tends to be overkill. Pretty much everything I did after, sophomore year of college or something is probably beyond anything I'll ever have to use in the industry. But the idea of turning like an idea into some mathematical problem that you can solve is really the key. And I'd say, why is it a well-worn path in data science? People that do that every day for undergrad or for grad school too, you have a huge advantage over anyone else who doesn't do that every day and doesn't have that confidence in their mathematical or programming abilities.
Right. So, when I co-founded Zest, Douglas, my co-founder, was very adamant about the power of AI underwriting. And I was honestly a bit of a skeptic. We'd been through, actually, a friend of mine in the industry said, once every 5 years, I lose a year of my life to the next great thing in underwriting. And I was concerned that this was another one of those cycles. And I became a real convert pretty quickly. What was the aha moment for you, or the breakthrough? Like, when did you say this is the real deal and it's not just scientific exploration, if you will?
Yeah, that's a funny question because I think I view it a little differently. I don't know if I had that aha moment, and probably because I didn't come from a traditional credit background, like you or Mike Armstrong, or
you didn't know enough to be skeptical.
Exactly. You guys had some preconceived notions about what worked and what needed to be done, and from a lot of perspectives, right? From performance, from compliance. You guys all worked at Capital One, so your view is a little different than mine. But I'd say, for me, from the hard sciences, we're used to having complicated mathematical problems to solve. We know how to simplify things into toy models that get us a good enough answer. And I also say, like, machine learning to me made sense as a function approximator. We don't really know the functional relationships between our inputs and what our predictions are. So, hey, let's go find an algorithm to do that for us. So, a lot of that really made sense to me. I think, what kind of surprised me the most was why it had sort of a much bigger impact, I think, in credit than maybe other industries, at least from my perspective. And maybe it's because there's an inherent risk in lending. The dollars go out the door. It's a big risk who you give money to. Decisions relate directly to dollars too. And also the competitive landscape is pretty severe. So any edge you can get really helps your business. So yeah, I didn't have an aha moment necessarily about machine learning, but I was surprised at how much impact it could have in our industry.
So we've worked with some really large data sets, up to 5 million observations. We've worked with some really small data sets. So we talk about that in terms of row space, which is the number of observations you have, and column space, which is the number of variables or features you have. Can you talk about what the challenges are of dealing with both those, both the large data sets and the small data sets?
Yeah. So large data set, a lot of the problems that we encounter are more technical, I'd say. They are, is your machine big enough to handle that data? Do you have enough time? We work in an industry where we want to turn things around quickly. We don't want things turned to a science project where we spend a lot of time. So, when you wrap your head around a large data set, you're trying to figure out how do you navigate this large data set as efficiently as possible. Just building a model could take an hour or it could take half a day. So trying to iterate through results and come to some conclusions about what modeling choices you want to make can take significantly longer than it does on a smaller data set. Now, that said, the machine learning algorithms we use, such as gradient boosting, like an XGBoost implementation, really do extract more and more value out of data as you get larger and larger row spaces. So it's a good problem to have, but sometimes it does slow things down considerably. So I'd say that's the main concern I have with larger ones. Small data sets are different. You're taking it on faith that this small data set is representative of what you want to find in the real world. These algorithms are prone to overfit, and the less data you have, the more difficult it is to ascertain whether you're overfitting or not. So you have to be quite careful with smaller data sets in our industry. On the other hand, small data sets give you the opportunity to launch quickly and iterate quickly. And so we tend to push our clients that, if you have a small data set, hey, let's build a model that maybe it's geared towards some shorter term targets that we can collect data in a few months and review the results, supplement our data set, maybe double the size of the data set, rebuild the model and iterate quickly to get towards a better answer.
Yeah, that is one of the advantages we had at Zest is we were a short-term loan product and we were growing quickly. And so we were doubling our row space kind of every couple of months, it felt like. So if I now turn to maybe the column space, in terms of feature selection, just from the credit bureaus now, you can get in the US several thousand features, many of which are kind of permutations of various things on it. But how do you go about getting to the features that really matter rather than just features that are maybe correlated but not really stable, predictive, whatever we might want to say?
Yeah, that's a great question. My view on this has changed quite a bit over the last 10 or 15 years. When I started in machine learning, I had this sense that given a data set, there was some perfect combination of features, and you had to expend significant energy mining through all these different combinations of features to find this optimal data set. All these different models that you can find on those columns to figure out what's the best model. And it seemed daunting, I'd say. I guess where I've kind of fallen over the last 10 years is, like you said, credit data, there's thousands of features. They're highly correlated. They're all lots of redundancy. There's a pool of information in that data set. And we're trying to extract it as efficiently as possible. It doesn't mean optimally, spending years trying to find the optimal feature set. We're trying to find, efficiently the small set of features that we can use to build a predictive model. Because of that, my view of how you select the features for a model has changed quite a bit too. It used to be, like at Zest, for instance, we had 4 modelers. They'd all go sit in a room by themselves for months doing univariate feature investigations, and everything kind of took forever to do. And we kind of wrote it off as, this is extremely complex kind of PhD level research that we're doing. I think now what we try to do is let's let the models tell us what the most important features are. We tend to rely more on feature importance coming out of models and some other more sophisticated modern techniques to filter out, how can we get a representative set of features in this model that gives us as close to optimal performance as we can get without spending months and months iterating.
Yeah. So you mentioned that kind of your evolution. There's certainly been an evolution in technology. As I recall at Zest, our modelers would spin up several virtual machines and it might take several days to chunk through what I think now we would consider a relatively small data set. Now we can run those, on laptops. The other change, as I recall, is we were pretty successful with random forest back then, and that seemed kind of the predominant technology. And now, as you mentioned, it's XGB, or that's one we use pretty much all the time. Can you explain what gradient boosting is in relatively simple English?
Yeah, GBM, we used it in my last few years at Zest. There was an R implementation that kind of became a gold standard before XGBoost kind of came out. And there's other variants now, Light GBM, and there's a Cat Boost implementation. They all perform fairly similarly. They have different nuances underneath the hood. I'd say, why GBM? So why do we use this? They're very popular on tabular data sets. What's a tabular data set? That is, something you can put in an Excel file. It's kind of like a square data set. And I say that because it's quite different than what we find in the AI world now, where data sets are, amorphous corpuses of text or videos, or, in our case, it's quite simple. It's like a 2-dimensional kind of matrix that we're trying to use. So how does a GBM work? I mean, the great thing about GBM is it's built on a very simple concept, which is a decision tree. I think even if you don't mathematically know what one is, conceptually, you kind of have variables that split the data, and then below each split, you have more splits. And as you go further and further in the tree, you get a more refined prediction. That's what's known as a weak learner. By weak, it means it doesn't extrapolate very well to new data. It's pretty good at the data you gave it to, but it tends to underperform on outside data. But the great thing about weak learners, you can actually improve them quite easily. And the way you do that is through what's called gradient boosting. For instance, you build the first tree, you have some predictions out of that. You can compare those to the actuals, what the real data that was underlying each of those instances. And between the predictions and the actuals, you have a difference. You can call it a residual, gradient, whatever. But the way that gradient boosting works is that then builds a second tree that tries to improve the predictions of the first tree. And that's where the real power in XGBoost comes in over something like you said, like random forest. A random forest makes a bunch of decision trees, but they're all independent, built with different slices of the data, which in itself gives you a better prediction than a simple individual tree, but it's not actually iterating towards a better solution. It's just kind of crowdsourcing a better model. Gradient boosting, because it has this iterative quality where it's kind of following the gradient, trying to find a better and better prediction, it can build a significantly better model than a single tree. Because of some other aspects of decision trees, because they just kind of split the data, they find a split point and find the best split point across these different variables. It's not sensitive to kind of the nuances of particular data sets, such as nonlinearities, such as interaction effects, even missing data. All these things can be easily accommodated in these trees. So for those two reasons, it's become extremely powerful, at least in our little world.
So, I grew up with logistic regression models. And, if I go back to when I started in this industry almost 40 years ago, it was, I think our model had maybe 6 to 10 variables in it. Relatively simple, but powerful relative to everything else at the time. And the challenge of a regression model is that it wants the world to behave like a straight line. And so you kind of have to go through some contortions to convert every variable into a straight line. And one of the things that you tend to do is if those straight lines don't work out, you go and you segment, and so you say, here's what my model is going to look like for thin files versus people who have previous bankruptcies versus kind of normal files. And we've gone through this experiment with some clients where, because I think they come from a logistic background, they want to do a segmentation before we go and do the modeling. Can you talk about why we found that isn't worth the effort, and what it is about gradient boost that makes that unnecessary?
Yeah, 100%. We've had this conversation with, especially if you're an existing lender in a more traditional space, been around for many years. They definitely want to explore machine learning, but yeah, they have the segmentation that they've used and they expect that they will need that going forward. I think the main challenge with segmentation is you have two sides of the coin, right? The segmentation, as you said, you can gear it towards smaller populations that maybe have a more consistent credit profile, like a thin file, but it also splits the data set up. And so you're actually stealing records from, for instance, an XGBoost model and not letting it use that information to flesh out sort of the whole predictive space. So it makes a lot of sense, like you said, in logistic, where you're fitting these coefficients, those coefficients can be quite different for these different populations. On the other hand, in a tree structure with, XGBoost, which has a multiple trees, sequentially, it's actually going to use all those rows to kind of build out that segmentation itself. It's a kind of inherent into the tree structure. And so we can't really take that on face value. If our clients are interested in exploring segmentation, we're more than happy to explore that with them. But I would say that we haven't found very many instances where segmentation helps. In most cases, it hinders the predictive power of the model. A single monolithic model using all those rows to build out those trees tends to outperform anything with segmentation. I'll say there's a caveat to that. There's a few situations where we do find segmentation useful. And that can be, hey, if the data sources that we have in a model aren't overlapping in time or have different maybe lending products involved in the model, then there's some usefulness in breaking those apart, because maybe the predictions together are worse than separated, maybe 2 models or 3 models. But for the most part, if you have a consistent data set with a consistent through-the-door population of people, we do find that a single model outperforms any segmentation due to the decreased row space for those model builds.
When you have these trees in gradient boost, it's kind of impossible to read. Like, I think if you dumped it out, we had a client who had to dump it all into a CSV or something like that. And it was like 10,000 lines. And obviously that's really, really hard to understand. I think the nice thing about a logistic is I can look at it, or a scorecard, I can look at it and I can more or less understand it, and I can intuit why it makes sense. How do you get interpretability with a tool like gradient boost that is more opaque?
Yeah, I think you have to definitely change your frame of reference. Like you said, you can print out a logistic model onto an Excel sheet and see some coefficients and other metrics about the fit and kind of understand a lot about it. You don't have that option with XGBoost. So you have to invent new tools and new visualizations to make sure that you understand what the model's doing and make sure that you can comfortably explain that to, hey, your risk team, to your compliance team, to maybe government regulators. So, it's been in flux over the last decade. There's new tools that have been invented, like the SHAP, SHAP values, very popular now. That tends to be used for generating stuff such as adverse actions out of machine learning models. It's able to extract a level of understanding about how predictions are working that you don't get otherwise. Imposing things like monotonic constraints onto variables so that you can understand exactly how the tree is using the variable, even though it might be different on a case by case basis. If you understand that it's always saying this feature risk will increase as this feature increases. If you can say that for certain with monotonic constraints, then that lets you intuit a lot more about how the model's behaving. Visualizations, again, it's hard to look at just a sequence of coefficients for each variable. You can't really do that. So we have to find ways of, looking at partial dependency plots or these SHAP values again to see how the model is using each of the features. I'd also say, in the larger world, governing bodies have grown to understand that machine learning, does good things, right? It drives up acceptance across the board in general, across in disparate impacts. It's going to increase, the people that can get a loan. And so the predictions coming out of these machine learning models are in general approving more people. And so a government body coming in and saying that this is illegal because it's a little more complicated than logistic regression is no longer the case. They've accepted that as long as we can peer in the black box and understand what the variables are doing and understand what the predictions are doing and understand how they're working as far as fair lending goes, then for the most part, we found great acceptance across compliance in-house and also from government regulators. So I guess, the way I would kind of wrap it up is we just don't blindly assume that the machine learning model is good. And this is a big problem with more junior data scientists I've seen, where you kind of just throw the data into a model and say, hey, it's done, it's working great. You really have to crack open the hood, do rigorous analytics, based on all of our experience to understand and feel confident that every variable is treated in a way that you understand and all the predictions that are coming out are working in a way that you understand.
Yeah, you always refer to that as the blue collar work, which I really love. You mentioned the regulatory environment. So 15, 16 years ago, we heard from a lot of organizations, these are just clearly illegal. And that's obviously changed there. I think all the largest banks are certainly using them in the US. What do smaller organizations need to know about how they do model risk management here and make sure that the models are compliant and are going to kind of behave over time, given that it's something that they're not familiar with?
Yeah, and again, I think it's we're in a good place in history with this. I'd say 10 years ago, even, it was kind of the Wild West. People were using this based on their own opinions, but no one really knew how to explain it to other people. Things were kind of muddied up, I'd say, with what we do today versus what you call AI, I'd say. I think even at Zest back in the day, what we do was viewed as, hey, this models are auto training real time as data comes in. And hey, these models are using social media data to predict loan risk. In reality, where our industry has kind of settled is, these are extremely powerful statistical algorithms that just outperform logistic regression. We're putting all the guardrails in place around it so that we feel as safe as we did with logistic regression, but we're getting a lot more predictive power. And so we kind of have to put all of the sort of more complicated AI concerns aside and take it on, within your company, that as long as you put these safe guardrails around the model, it's safe to use. It's not doing anything that's illegal or unsavory from a risk management perspective. I'd say we also have another benefit in our risk that, I'd say the losses that we can realize with a bad model makes it sort of self-governing. Like no one's going to go launch some crazy model that's going to do some crazy stuff, right? Because if you do, you're going to lose all your money, go out of business. So we're all risk averse and we all want to make the best decisions possible without putting our companies at risk. So I'd say, yeah, the power of ML was just impossible to ignore, I think. And over the last 5 to 10 years, almost every bank, fintech, lending institution is transitioned to machine learning in some form or another. It lets you make better decisions, improve more people, incorporate more data, and hence your decisions are going to be more nuanced.
So then can you contrast that? We kind of lump machine learning in with AI, but you drew a distinction between, the techniques like gradient boost and LLMs. Why is it that LLMs maybe aren't ready in underwriting or just aren't valid yet?
Yeah, you think about what an LLM is trained to do. It's reading huge amounts of textual information and drawing all these relationships between that. And then when you give it some context through your interaction with an LLM, it's able to, produce output that is similar to what you were expecting if you had gone and done that research yourself. That has really nothing to do with what a gradient boost machine learning model is doing. It's very directly has, this set of features that are numerical values that are predicting this particular outcome, which could be just a binary simple 0-1 flag for default. It's laser focused on getting that correct. The more data you have, the better analytics you can put around it. If you look at an LLM, it's what does it know about lending? And so it's just a bit of a disconnect that it would automatically make a better model or apply to what we do. Now that said, the technology behind ChatGPT, the transformer sort of architecture and other kind of nuances of how people build these deep networks, 100% is going to impact us in our space at some point. We've seen some progress in the last few years around sort of similar architectures geared towards tabular data sets that we've explored. And I don't think they outperform XGBoost yet or other gradient boosting technologies, but I do expect at some point someone will, find some architectures that can significantly help our work. And that's exciting news for us, right? We've all been using XGBoost for quite a while. It's, I'd say, a commodity across the industry or similar algorithms. So yeah, anything else that comes out that could give us a little bit of an edge, welcome with open arms.
Yeah. So it'd be nice to believe that your local bank could just dump their data into ChatGPT and it would kick out a model. But as you're saying, that's not the case. How should smaller lenders think about using these tools, given that they obviously don't have the resource of a Chase or a Capital One? What's the best path forward for them to engage in this?
Yeah, first off, I think you need to have a strong data science team that has lots of experience in this space. So, for a lot of companies, maybe the solution is to partner with someone like Ensemble X. Obviously, we've done that for a lot of companies. But otherwise, you need to build up a team in some form or another of data scientists that have direct experience here. I would say that's not just one or two kind of junior people. I think you need people that have done this for quite a while and, in our particular industry. There's other options. I'd say, obviously, bigger banks are going to have more data, more capital. It's hard to compete against that. So I'd say it's really a data war. The better models come out of having more and more data. So how do you get more data? Maybe that's through partnerships. Maybe that's data exchange. Maybe that's purchasing retro files, from one of the providers to beef up the data you can put into a model to get competitive. Maybe that's using more alternative data. We have a shift towards more open banking type of data. Given certain customer profiles, there's other alternative data sources out there that you could use. So you have to really find where you can find an edge. But yeah, it is a difficult, basically because of capital constraints to compete against the bigger banks. I would say the benefit that a fintech has is nimbleness. You're not like the Titanic trying to steer it, away from the iceberg with huge risk teams, huge compliance teams, huge development teams that take lots of resources to move new initiatives through the company. I think, at Zest, a group of 12, 20, 30 people, we could get things done extremely quickly. So you got to take that as a positive and use it to your advantage.
Yeah. So you mentioned, that we've advised clients. I mean, you specifically have built models for a bunch of companies all over the world, but you've also advised folks on doing that. What is the difference there, and what is it that you bring that allows them to use their internal data scientists, but benefit from the experience, that we've had at Ensemble X and Zest before that?
Yeah, I think our experience in international markets, in particular LATAM, it is harder to find data science talent in those markets, although that's changing, as we go forward in time. But it's not like the US where there's a glut of maybe talented folks that you can pull from. I think it's a little harder to find them and pay them market rates. So partnering with someone like us is helpful in those situations as we can bridge that gap till they can get their own in-house team in place. I'd say the challenges that we face in international markets, stuff like regulatory framework doesn't really exist. It's, again, back to the Wild West, which can be to your advantage, but also without a framework, you don't really know what the risks are going forward. You don't know how things could change. And we've had some, certainly in some geographies, where we've had to really turn work around very quickly when we found out that there was some regulatory scrutiny coming that we weren't aware of to begin with. Also, data sources are a bit more iffy and sparse. And so it's very different than the United States, where you have three credit bureaus that each can give you thousands of features that are very similar to each other and encapsulate everyone's credit history. You can, go somewhere in Latin America where most of people's transactions are not on their bank account, they're not on a credit card, they're cash transactions. So you don't have any access to information. So you're going to have a lot of people missing from your data. Also, we've had some geographies where governments decided they didn't like a data source and were forced to kind of delete it or change it in some way. And again, you have to be very nimble when you encounter those things. Just on the flip side of that is, again, given those constraints or those difficulties, the competitive landscape does provide more opportunity, because if you don't have a lot of competitors that are using machine learning or using significantly diverse data sources, then when you invest in ML, that can really help you drive growth over your competitors.
Yeah. So last question, you kind of referenced this. We've seen environments where data kind of got pulled or access to it got limited, reduced. But we've also seen, even here in the US, kind of the growth of these credit builder products, distorted some variables on the bureau, and therefore distorted that we had built. How do you adapt a model to deal with a changing environment, whether it's variable changing over time or regulatory changes?
Yeah, at Ensemble X here, we don't just build models for people. We're really a partner in the model building and model launch monitoring process. So we stick around, hopefully with all our clients for several years after we build them a model. A huge part of that relationship is model monitoring. So we're constantly monitoring any inputs that go into the model to see if there's been any changes. That can be due to different sources. Like you said, that could be something behind the scenes that we don't know about. That could just be marketing shifts in the company we're working with or other macroeconomic shifts. And so we're laser focused on seeing any shifts in our underlying distribution of clients coming in or customers coming in. Similarly, the scores produced by the model, we're monitoring those to make sure that we're not unexpected shifts of any of the approvals that we're doing and work through that with our clients. So, when we see a problem, that can come out of our monitoring work. It could come directly from our client. We jump on it quickly. The last thing the machine learning models, as Shawn used to like to say, they're like overfitting machines, right? They're very good at knowing what they know, but they're not very good at extrapolating to new situations. So it can quickly go off the rails if your underlying data is changing in some fundamental way. And so what you really have to do is be on the lookout for these things and really iterate quickly. We've had situations where during the launch of a model, we had a feature that looked a certain way in our development data set. And then when we went to what we call shadow scoring, which we turn the model on and look at the variables coming in and view the performance, we saw that the variable actually changed quite drastically over the course of a month and then reset the first of every month. And it was just because of how the calculation was being done behind the scenes. It was something like a month since derogatory or something. Any way you can imagine however you calculate what a month is, it would kind of have the sawtooth pattern. And so people would be scored differently if they applied on, say, the 30th of the month versus the first of the month. And so in those situations, what we end to do is urgently, obviously, wrap our heads around the situation and we try to iterate through the model. Can we remove these features? Can we apply some constraints or maybe some transforms on the feature to help them in the model look like what we expected from the past? A lot of times what ends up happening is we end up making a business decision that the impact isn't big enough to warrant any changes. Sometimes we end up having to take a variable out. But regardless, we're always there and we're always scrutinizing the model. Once you build it, it's not ready for the next 2 years. On a daily, weekly basis, you really have to make sure it's still working.
Yeah, thank you for that. Now I'm going to emphasize that. I think if I had to say what I think the biggest mistake organizations make with modeling is they focus on the building of the modeling and then kind of ignore the monitoring. I mean, we've talked to organizations that say they review their models once a year. And I would guess if they say once a year, they probably mean once every 18 months. And the problem with that, I think what happens is your model goes off the rails, start making decisions, and then it takes a while for those decisions to reveal themselves as wrong. And that's when people kind of jump up and say, hey, what happened with our model? And so you could have booked 6, 9, 12 months worth of loans that you shouldn't have at that point. So I really appreciate you focusing on model monitoring. It's a really critical part of the model risk management process that I think gets less attention than it deserves. So on that note, you can follow Ensemble X and you can follow Jim McGuire on LinkedIn. You can also visit us at ensemblex.com. You can find the Ensemble X Exchange podcast on all major platforms. Thank you for joining us, Jim.
Thanks, John. Had a great time.
And thank you all for listening.